Hello again, I am Blunty, and hey, we can all now count the number of days left before MHWilds launches on a single, standard human hand. For those of you with limb differences, feel free to count on whatever appendages or handy desktop items you prefer. But as we get to that launch day, more and more people are making their decisions and pulling the trigger on buying the game. It's already suddenly spiked to the #1 seller on Steam this week, and even though we don't have accessible data on it, it's hard not to imagine it doing at least as well, if not noticeably better, over on the consoles, particularly PlayStation, one of the traditional homes of a large portion of the long-term player community of Monster Hunter. And I've already been seeing more and more people in the last few days alone get increasingly unsure about where to buy the game once they've made the decision to actually buy it. And it's screenshots like this presented alongside that question that are really making me worry about people being properly informed on a super key issue here so they don't make a massive mistake when it comes to spending their hard-earned. We're going to be talking about one of the larger concerns that have been floating around this title for a while now, but it centers around the PC version, and we're sliding it up against what the console experience will be like, because that's the choice we're talking about here. And I'm talking about Framegen. Now, everyone who's come to this video probably already knows the basics on Framegen, and for the purposes here, we really don't need to dig into exactly how it all happens, the machine learning, the motion vectors and whatnot. And while in the beginning, it was very rough and had a lot of visual issues and artifacting that made it largely unpleasant to use, frankly, we are a few iterations deep into the development of the technology now, and it has started working shockingly well these days. However, what I'm seeing far too many people get wrong is when Framegen is useful. Now, I've gone over this a couple of times in the recent past in other Wilds-related videos. That discussion was kind of buried in the middle of other stuff as a kind of side note. So this video, I want to focus on it so I can try and reach as many of you who are under mistaken impressions as I can. Because if you get this wrong, if you make a decision based on crappy information or mistaken assumptions, you are going to have a real bad time with this game. A much worse time than you should be having. So, firstly, a massive issue is a catastrophically bad decision Capcom have made. They're telling people the wrong thing, and I've taken a bat to the knees more than once about this, and I'm not going to shut up about it anytime soon. And it is the fact that the devs themselves are listing, under the recommended specs for PC, their high specs, and even their ultra specification settings, 60 FPS performance with frame generation enabled. What that means in the real world is the real native frame rate, that is, the number of frames the game is generating, is 30 FPS. Which wouldn't be a huge issue if they were just honest about that in a much more open and explicit way, a way that can't mislead people who aren't really familiar with how all this works. If you're telling people you're targeting 30 FPS, fine, you're going to get some blowback, of course, but fine. I played thousands, literally thousands of hours of Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak on my Nintendo Switch at 30 FPS. And while I personally target 60 FPS when I have the option, like when Rise came to PC, I ran it at 60 and it felt fantastic, I also consider 45 FPS to be the minimum target PC users should look for a very nice balance between gameplay fluidity, feel, and graphics for this specific game, for Monster Hunter Wilds. I don't think 45 FPS is a good target for some games, but for this particular game, I have tested it personally at 45, and I do know it feels and flows good. That is the minimum floor that I recommend. And when we're talking consoles, the default resolution priority mode on consoles is for a 30 FPS target. So the game has been developed with that in mind, so the gameplay experience is, acceptable at 30 FPS, if not ideal for many, which is why we have options. Consoles will also have a balanced mode for 40 FPS target, really nice if you happen to have one of those TVs with 120 Hz refresh rates on them. And there's also a performance mode for a 60 FPS target. Sacrifices a little more on graphics to give you a smoother feel. The problem, though, is frame generation is not designed and not intended and explicitly not recommended for this kind of use. That being, taking a game from 30 to 60 FPS. Both NVIDIA and AMD are extremely specific in their tech sheets when they talk about this stuff, in their recommendations. and their intents and the descriptions of these technologies. They both say that each respective frame technology from both companies are supposed to be used, are intended to be used, with the game already performing at around 60 FPS or better. Because the intent of this technology is to provide greater visual fluidity and even smoother motion presentation on high refresh rate screens, such as the common 144Hz and above screens that have been becoming increasingly popular amongst PC gamers for many years now. And the reason they do not advise its use at lower frame rates is because frame generation increases lag. It's a physics thing. It takes time for the graphics card to analyze the current frames being produced by the game engine, the real frames, and then artificially generate new frames using the machine learning, the clever algorithms and whatnot, to make these fake frames and stick them in between the real ones. It doesn't take much time, and today's cards even have special parts of their design in their hardware meant specifically to accelerate exactly this kind of calculation, but it does take time nonetheless. And that does mean there's an overall slight decrease in native performance while these extra calculations are done constantly, and a corresponding increase in input latency, the time it takes for what's on screen to reflect what inputs you're giving the game from your controller or mouse or keyboard are doing. And it is a severe enough issue that both AMD and Nvidia also have developed other technologies to go alongside this to try and help negate some of this extra input latency. Anti-lag stuff, which does help, but it cannot completely eliminate it. But at high native frame rates, above 60 FPS at the very least, the amount of this extra input latency is largely negligible in most games, enough that the average gamer won't feel it, won't notice it, or at least not to an extent that actually affects gameplay in a notable negative way. However, at lower native frame rates, such as the 30 FPS Capcom are suggesting you use for frame gen with Wilds, this extra input latency is significantly noticeable. And in a game like Monster Hunter, that issue is noticeably deleterious to gameplay. It makes the game feel worse. It feels goddamn horrible, in fact. Again, I've tested this personally, and it will make the game functionally worse to play. Nvidia know this, AMD know this, which is why they tell you not to do this. So yeah, when I see screenshots like this one, from someone testing the benchmark for Wilds on their ROG Ally handheld gaming PC, a device I also own, and I see them asking if they should play like this, if this is good enough, because they really want to use the portability, that's the reason they like their ROG Ally, it's a handheld gaming PC, it's fantastic, or should they get it on their Xbox and make sure the gameplay experience is solid? I really worry when I see this stuff, and again, I've seen more and more of it in the last few days, because that 42 FPS average right there, 1080p, medium settings, seems fine, right? Seems pretty good, actually. Right until you see that green bar underneath the FPS average, that denotes that this benchmark was done with frame generation on, which means, of course, the native frame rate is actually barely 21 FPS. And I don't think I need to labor this, but 21 FPS in Monster Hunter is going to feel so bad, so sluggish, and the motion is going to be so juddery. And at this kind of frame rate, you're going to have so much native input lag all on its own that it will be effectively unplayable. Like trying to play this game at 20 FPS? Good luck. Even if you can tolerate how it looks at 20 FPS, you're going to suck at the game. You're going to really suck at the game. Additionally, those of us who have run this benchmark also have noticed that the average represents multiple kinds of gameplay, including cinematic style stuff, and that the toughest scenes in the game, in the open field, are going to be lower than that average. And those are the ones that matter, because that's where the fights happen, the real gameplay. So here's some footage of me actually using these exact settings this guy used on my own ROG Ally to show you. And yeah, that performance in the field there, that's the kind of frame rate you're going to have when you're trying to fight a monster. That's how it's going to feel. 15 FPS. 24 if you go deeper in the desert. Still not anywhere close to acceptable. So even if FrameGen stops it looking quite as visually stuttery, so it doesn't look like 15 FPS anymore, it looks more like 30. And in fact, again, because of the overhead that FrameGen creates, the game is still going to feel worse than even this 15 to 24 FPS. It's going to be a little bit worse than that. See how my own non-FrameGen score in the benchmark is higher than the identical settings on this other person's identical handheld? That is the overhead of the FrameGen hurting native performance. We're using exact the same settings on exact the same hardware, and my score is still higher because I didn't use FrameGen. So just before we move on, I just want to say the game can be playable on the Ally. You have to make a few more sacrifices than medium 1080p though. I have played it there in the beta, and the beta is worse performing than the final game will be, but I still got to a decent playability level. It's not pretty, but it's playable. I don't know if I want to do my entire playthrough on that, but for just, when I want to go handheld, curl up a bit or something, and, farm some parts or whatever, it's going to be fine. But outside of that specific case, there are people out there who do own multiple platforms who need to make a choice about where to play Wilds. It's no secret that Wilds is a hog of a game, and you need pretty modern and decently spunky PC hardware to juice up the graphics settings, exactly like Monster Hunter World was before it, by the way, at its own launch. It was also a pig, which I've already snapped apart in another video, by the way. It's unfortunate, but not unexpected that we're repeating history here. But this means people who commonly game on their PC, but also keep a console around, probably mostly for exclusives and whatnot like I do, might seriously be considering buying Wilds on console just to sidestep all this PC performance fuss. Completely reasonable decision to be thinking about. And unlike previous multi-platform Monster Hunter releases, this game is fully cross-play. So where you buy your copy of the game won't affect who you can actually play with. So all your friends on any platform that this game is available on, you can all play together. It's great. Even Xbox players, historically the smallest platform for Monster Hunter titles, are not going to be left in the dark on this because, hey, crossplay. Random multiplayer matchups are going to be from the entire player base, not just a little section of it. It's going to be fantastic. So all of that makes the choice much easier, of course. So, please, if you are using the benchmark tool on your PC to balance out a decision on PC versus console, do not use FrameGen as part of that decision if your PC can't do at least 45 FPS in the settings you are visually satisfied with. But again, one more time, let me repeat, not at 30 FPS base. Do not use FrameGen from 30. I promise you, trying to use FrameGen from that base will feel worse. It will make you a crappier player too, especially once you get to the more demanding monster fights where timing of dodges and blocks and exploitable openings and all that becomes a lot tighter. The game is going to feel better and you are going to be a better gamer at these higher frame rates. Good news is, if you do go console, while I've not had the chance myself personally, I have heard from multiple other content creators, whose opinions I know I can reasonably rely on to be earnest. All have said in their experience with near final builds they've had previous sessions with recently, they are performing much cleaner. They're running much smoother and presenting a lot better graphically than the beta was on console, especially in the 60 FPS performance mode apparently. So, let's recap on all this advice just to nail it home, because I really do think this is vitally important for people to understand. PC versus console. Don't take frame generation into your performance monitoring considerations. It is not a performance enhancing tool. It is an aesthetic tool you can use for high refresh rate screens if and only if you can already reach a nicely playable frame rate. It is not supposed to cheat your way into a playable frame rate. That is not what it's for, that is not how it works, and you will make your gameplay experience worse if you try and use it like that. Now, as you can probably derive from my attitude here, I'm not a huge fan of FrameGen in general. I'm not in the screeching about fake frames camp or anything, but I do tend to avoid it overall, if at all possible, at any opportunity. Outside of, testing stuff, I don't think I've used it in any actual extended gameplay or playthrough or anything in any game it's offered in. But if you do want to use it, it is getting better. And the current iteration of the technology is surprisingly good at the job. Very few sort of visual artifacts and issues and crap like that. But developers like Capcom, who go against the advice and instruction of the people who make this technology, this FrameGen technology, they invented it. They know what it's for. They know why they made it. developers like Capcom come along and suggest using it in not only incorrect ways, but gameplay harmful ways, they really need a kick in the knees over it. It is not acceptable for them to be telling people to use Framegen at 30 FPS native, also they can advertise that their game runs at 60 FPS on PC. It is dishonest. So thank you all for watching. Hopefully you got something useful out of this video. I am Blunty. I will catch you next time. And thank you as always to the patrons whose above and beyond support I very much appreciate.